Pentagon admits it can't account for $2 trillion again.
You've been keeping track of what the CIA and the Defense Department have been doing for a long time as far as using us as guinea pigs for mind control and other types of horrible things they have in mind for us and the rest of the people in the world. What are some of them?
Well, it started out basically with the CIA doing experimentations on their own men to discover if they could get rid of agents who were going to quit the department and still had classified information. So they utilized different types of drugs and pain and hypnosis and electric shock to try and get the guys to forget. Then they also did experimentations to using different chemicals to see if you can induce a person to commit a crime or induce him to do that or to do this. Of course, the CIA claimed that it didn't carry it through. The documentation we got was actually that they did that.
Their criminal war on David is their leverage on the basis of those fundamental issues, such as their parasitic tamping or taking of the profits from the Americans in order to engage in an unauditable extortion racket against the American civilian population, which they have declared war on. And the act of engagement of the war against the American public is the establishment of high priority targets for those important to the American security, at which point they have a targeting list of highly important people who are being suppressed and humiliated and defamed under their smear factories for the ridicules, for their suppressions. Their targeting of conservatives and Christians and other groups actively is the maintenance of the replacement of the American system with the Nazi Confederate arrangements, which systematically engages in the function of espionage war through the color of law and the color of office, which has no authority in the United States, in order to engage in the voter fraud, which subsequently replaces the American government with the terrorists, at which point you have many engagements, such as their theory in their targeting of David Bowles under the assumption that he would become the highest grade general over the intelligence, the military intelligence oversight mechanism at the highest branch would have actively been traded from David's network, which would have actively engaged in the exchanges of profitable businesses, which would have engaged in his taxation systems, which he would have traded with the states and federal government in order to establish political currency, generating his leverage in order to establish himself under even the Nazi system, which could not deny his original wealth, at which point the act of disillusionment of the Americans requires them to oppose anything that is pro-American, at which point their destruction of their assumption of his wealth would have been fundamental to their war strategy, as the alternative included David acquiring the wealth in order to acquire the political influence, which would have established American law and order. His company, which many of the communities abused by the Nazis would have wanted to have built in order to trade with David, would have had to have gone through his vetting systems in order to get him to sign for it, qualifying his starting assets from birth, which means David would not have needed parents or guardians. He is independently wealthy and born king, at which point the mechanism from that system would have generated the various developments of his training, which would have included the intelligence oversight mechanism of military law enforcement, the systematic disillusionment of the Nazi corruption systems, which have actively been infiltrating the United States government, such as the sheriff's departments. Now, their character for the Confederate loyalist sheriffs, as opposed to the American sheriffs, would have actively been generating several rackets, such as the development of high school bullies in order to create the normal structure of abuse. The Ubermensch structure generates the ability to normalize the abuse and dehumanizing of their victims, so that they can, on the basis of having been culturally adapted to the condemnation on the basis of being targeted, of any of their targets who, being guilty of nothing else except being the focus of attention, would normalize their structure of their arbitrary fraudulent abuses. Their estimate for David's character, having been highly trained in martial arts and many of the other affairs, would have actively been infiltrating these groups and high schools, etc., which would have generated the systematic mechanism of him breaking their power centers and replacing them with the patriarchy's order. And David, establishing himself as the patriarchy, asserts the new order, at which point his function in the government, through many of the other structures, including the 21 Jump Street type of structure, which would have systematically replaced the corruption with the American order systems. The patriarchy, being the thing that David was accused of, puts him in a position where he's the masculine order in charge of the restructuring of society, which generates the exponential threat to those who want the terrorism against the law-abiding civilians, as terrorism is the qualifier for armed robbery, their asset forfeiture system, which they wanted to develop for the armed robbery so that they could criminalize the money itself or property itself, allows for their fraudulent exchanges through the use of violence and intimidation in order to substantially change the structure of status in society, which is specifically prohibited. The changing of status without due process is illegal in the United States, and their theft of property is the destruction of the right to property and the right of the pursuit of happiness, as this is the subject of coercion, at which point if you take someone's dollar, you are coercing them worth $1, at which point your influence is generated by criminal extortion by the dollars in question. At which point the dismantling of these systems assumes the normal engagements of the normal cover stories and disillusionments of the subject. Now, when you have the estimates generated from their Final Fantasy VII engagement, like the engagement of Sephiroth burning Nibelheim, and then the rebuilding of Nibelheim in order to create an actor society, you have the complete destruction of the blueprints of the city, which allows them to rebuild it under the new structure of the Confederacy, allowing for the payment of the actors in order to pretend that everything's cool and normal and there was nothing particularly interesting going on, as they are paid actors there to lie to any potential visitors into dissuading from them investigating any potential damages generated by the Sephiroth character, which in this example would have been another high-ranked general, possibly a general of the Marines, or some other intelligence function, which would generate the consistent threat of the structure, as the Nazis would have gone from the FBI to trying to infiltrate the military sometime before the arrangements. They would have generated their various damages, which would include the full seizure of the United States military, which requires them to take over the military judges and military prosecutors in order to engage in the wizard terrorism. Now, when you investigate the structure, such as is presented by Lindsey Graham and others, there isn't a determinable difference between them and the KKK, except for you have the color of law and the color of office. They're just Confederates who have infiltrated the government and are extorting their office, which was originally done in the KKK several times, at which point the normalization of Confederate policies seems to be more or less the status quo of their arrangements. As this is an espionage war against the Americans, protecting their secrets is an act of treason against the United States Constitution, for the validation of Scalia's unitary executive theory mechanism is KKK terrorism without the function of the service of law, at which point you have the structure of their terrorism which ignores their service to law, which allows for the arbitrary manipulation of the subject, including Dr. Fauci's lying to Congress about the various experiments in diseases and bioweapons, which they have exponentially been studying for a long time in order to engage in war crimes against the Americans, which generates the systematic damages which are normalized in the threats against the civilians in order to prevent them from defending David, even if they bypass the position of the censorship and suppression of views, which includes the National News Corporation David would have had, which would have been a rival to CNN and Fox with similar viewership or more, which would constantly be engaged in the normal market of competition. Allowing for that, you understand that there is an exponential reduction in suppression of that system. And with that in mind, you have the various studies from the School of Hard Knocks estimate, which includes the studies of the development of the creation of society, which requires the high-grade investment into charisma and speaking, which includes the pastoral roles and the comedian roles, at which point David Bowles, if you uncensored it, is, according to the Confederate Warrants, the most censored comedian in American history, and that is fundamental to their engagement, as he is essential to the system of the American order, as the normal influence in entertainment structures creates the system of propaganda, which is the normal engagement of the telling of news from the political point of view of the political party. And David Bowles, forming his own political party, would have that type of propaganda, telling real news in light and the interest of his business exchanges as a network and a political party, which would generate his various exchanges. Now, the position of Facebook and Apple and many of the others normally trading is that they can have out-of-country places where they're allowed to store lots of extra money from their profits in order to divert taxes, which is something that David would have done, especially under California's interest to get him to start a new country, in which case putting his money into his country would specifically do that quicker, unless, of course, he made a trade with the various governments, the states and federal government, in order to engage in the option of having it available for taxation, which generates political currency and influence in the government, developing his trades in the power brokering between politicians, normalizing the American structure under his thing, at which point his veto would be fundamentally absolute by the time he was finished, cornering the Senate and expanding the judiciary, at which point most of the American politics working as normal, legally, and would not systematically be a primary interest for those investments as much as it would be the normal function of society, which, not being invested in, allows for more reserve value in those exchanges, allowing him to engage in the increasing of his political influence through the power brokering. By not spending the influence, he retains the influence, at which point business as usual is a profitable venture for his political party under his specific oversight, and the states and federal government wanting more money from him could make those negotiations which would increase the tax flow. Now, the state of Oregon's tax payment under that arrangement from the rest of the state would be less than David would be paying. Like Elon Musk currently pays the most taxes in America, and in the original arrangements from the American economy, not subverted by the Confederate wizard communism, would have had David taxes for Oregon be worth more than the rest of the Oregon taxpayers, at which point you have a higher market and a higher tax base, which engages in the higher profits for Oregon and the other states on the road to the presidency, systems of his investment into the states for his business network, which would generate the systematic arrangements for them to bypass the need to take out loans and other arrangements. Now, state debts are illegal, and without the additional stress from the Confederacy, the states that David would be a part of would not need them, as they would actively be trading with David and would have the adequate cash flow in order to take care of all of their legal policies, specifically to be enforced and funded as normal, at which point you would have the systematic removal of the need for the corruption which is inherent to the infection of the Confederates against the American politics as normal versus the infection. Now, in Final Fantasy, as the example, Genova is a world-eating parasite on a meteor which is sent to the planet as a part of the consistent recycling system of the world, which will go through a system where it will summon a meteor to destroy everything, and it will summon holy in order to eradicate all life on it, in order to dissolve the meteor, at which point the mutual apocalypses allows for the disillusionment of the previous government administration of their planet, which allows for the restarting of a new administration or planet. At which point the American version of this is the basis of the consistent voting system, which allows for the elected members of a government to leave their government, dissolving peacefully into the next government, at which point, with the complete disillusionment of the administration, you have the system of voting, which allows them to reconstruct the next set or quality of years under the replacement administration, which allows them to engage in the consistent refreshing of the political will of the American public. And that system was conveyed in that arrangement, but the problem is when you have the Confederate insurgency engaged in their espionage terrorism, it's similar to the Genova infecting the meteor, and the only real way to save the planet is to remove the Genova cells, the Genova influence, the Confederate influence, the wizard influence, the terrorism of mind-altering poisons and defamations and smear campaigns and terrorisms, and Nazi violence in general, which has actively manipulated the public will, allowing for them to bypass the consent of the governed, and the consistent voting systems of replacing the administration. The infection of the Genova exponentially compounds, it becomes worse. Each set becomes more reinforced from the previous infection, at which point the corruption compounding on itself compels for the only way to save the United States is the only way to save the world of Final Fantasy VII, which is the complete removal of the parasite. The Confederacy and the Americans have to be completely separated and put into their own state and managed by the Americans without arms or self-defense, as they are all felons threatening the stability and order of the United States. Similarly, the only way for the plans of Final Fantasy to survive, to not have the world completely destroyed and turned into a spaceship in order to sail the cosmos, in order to find a new planet to infect, would be to completely remove the Genova infection, which in the system of Final Fantasy VII, if I'm not mistaken, Sephiroth used Cloud in order to beat Genova, at which point Sephiroth would be the new thing, but he functioning as the new parasite would not substantively change the position of being a parasite or not a parasite, but he would rather be simply the replacement to the Genova. at which point the mother being completely dissolved and defeated through the systems of their long-term strategies just changes what the problem is, unless of course there would be new updates or something interesting along those lines, as the influence of the parasitic arrangement would have to specifically be settled, at which point it might be anything in particular, but that's just a series of fan fictions which people have been consistently sending to me, so I don't really have a lot of say in it. Whatever's canon is canon. The people from those companies are top notch, and it's a good story, but in the end, the fan fictions are ultimately irrelevant. But as far as that's concerned, we need to continue on to the system of the obligation to use this in order to incarcerate the Confederates into their own state in order to make them pay the fines under the original American system, which could not include any of the ex post facto terrorism from the Confederates' manipulation of the American politics, in which case it becomes a substantively alternative situation. And once you have the complete complete separation and settlements of all new arrangements and liabilities, you can restart the voting structure again without any of the damages, and it just becomes the status quo norm of the society, which would have overcome its greatest threat in history.